106. That is the number of talent changes in this patch for the Veteran, Psyker and Zealot classes. And in this video, I'm going to break down how our talent tree has evolved, what talents have changed, and what this means for our enjoyment of the classes. So let's get it on. To be more specific about the 106 talents earlier, the spread of the changes are as follows. Veterans have 29 changes, Psykers have 27, and Zealots have a whopping 50 changes made to them, which also includes some old talents being removed. Before we get any further into talking about talent changes, I want to first talk about how the shape of our talent trees has transformed. Here are pictures of our old talent trees, and if you look at it long enough, you'll spot the most problematic thing about its design. It siloed you pretty hard into a specific path, and trying to deviate away from it to reach neighboring nodes was either very expensive or impossible. This made build crafting very one-dimensional because you knew beforehand what was already going to be out of reach for you. It also meant that trying to experiment with different choices was hard because you would most likely be making too steep of a compromise. This problem was especially pronounced on the Zealot's talent tree because in order to take the other grenades that weren't throwing knives, for example, you were forced to pick up nodes that were specific to a certain build and a playstyle that you didn't want or need. I'm happy to say that with the new talent trees, Fat Shark has broken us out from being siloed into a particular path. As you can probably tell, this is a pretty big video, so I'm going to leave timestamps here, and you can skip ahead to the class you want to learn more about, or just keep watching throughout the entire thing. Now, without further ado, let's move on to the changes for each of the classes, starting with the Veteran. Let's begin with this nice little table here. This table shows you the difference in talents we have now compared to what we had before and attaches a number to show just how much better variety and choice we are getting with this update. While we technically have less nodes than before, the majority of them were small nodes being consolidated together or some talents being added into the base form. This means that each of our talent points is being used for more meaningful and impactful choices for our builds. Now let's talk about talents. We're going to do this in order so it's easier to grasp where the changes are being made, so feel free to pause and read the new updated talents being shown on screen. Starting with combat abilities, all abilities now can be used while sprinting. Infiltrate has its surprise attack support node removed and added into the base node. This means Infiltrate by default provides 30% damage after leaving stealth. Executioner Stance now also replenishes 10% toughness every second while it's active. Its support node, the bigger they are, now outlines monsters and captains as well and has its duration increased to 8 seconds. For our Blitz abilities, crack grenades have one additional charge, bringing it up from 2 to 3, and its fuse time has decreased from 2 seconds to 1 second, allowing it to explode faster. The chain time for instant throwing smoke grenades has reduced from 0.9 seconds to 0.2, allowing you to chuck them out faster. As for Keystones, Marksman's focus has received a bit of a rework. First, it no longer removes stacks on movement, so you're free to move around as much as you like. Stacks will now also decay one at a time every 5 seconds, and the stack duration can be refreshed on weak spot hits. As a result, the camouflage node has been removed as part of this rework. The supporting node, Tunnel Vision, has received a slight adjustment, reducing its toughness per stack from 5% to 4%. Weapon Specialist has had a few consolidations happen to it. Fleeting Fire, which provided reload speed, has been built into the Keystone itself and has been removed. Conditioning, which once provided stamina reduction, has been folded into the Invigorated node. Also, the duration of Ranged Specialist has been increased from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, affording you a bigger window to take advantage of the increased fire rate and reload speed. Finally, Focus Target has its numbers made more consistent. The total number of stacks at base has been reduced from 5 to 4, however, the damage buff has been increased from 4% to 5%. At the same time, the time it takes up to build up one stack has reduced from 2 seconds to 1.5 seconds. So in other words, you can get focus stacks up much faster, and for the same damage debuff, the supporting node Focus Fire now only increases your max stacks from 8 to 6, and the Redirect Fire node now gives 2% damage per stack instead. The total damage you get from this Keystone now has technically improved very slightly, but otherwise it's pretty much the same and is more consistent to use. As for the rest of the talents, Agile Engagement's weapon debuff duration has increased from 5 seconds to 6. Covering Fire has had its range increase from 5 meters to 8 meters, but now provides a 15% damage buff instead of 20%. Get Back in the Fight has had its cooldown reduced from 30 seconds to 20 seconds, and Grenade Tinkerer now increases the damage for crack grenades by 75%, up from 50%. Keep Their Heads Down now adds 75% more suppression to your attacks instead of 50%. One Motion's weapon swap speed has increased from 25% to 50%. Exhilarating Takedown now has its stacks decay one at a time, which massively improves its uptime. For the Emperor has been removed from the talent tree, and Born Leader not only has its toughness share increased from 15% to 20%, but now also increases coherency radius by 50%. Skirmisher now includes sliding into the mix. Tactical Awareness has been reworked. It now provides an extra 100% cooldown regeneration for 3 seconds on special kill instead of the flat 6 seconds. This will be a recurring change to normalize all cooldown regeneration nodes across all classes. Twin Blast has now been added into the Grenadier on top of its baseline ability to carry an extra grenade. Also, the Veteran's Suppression node is now built into the class itself, so you get the benefit of not being suppressed at all while fighting into gunfire without having to spend any points. Lastly, we have a couple of new talents being added into the mix. Covert Operative provides you with a 30% ranged backstab damage. This was once the Zealot's Ambuscade talent, but has been taken over by the Vet. And we also get Lock and Load, which increases your clip size by 15% rounded up, similar to the Arbitrator. This gives you a little more sustained damage output. Those were the key changes to the Veteran. Overall, there weren't too many new additions, but the changing of the talent tree pathing as well as the positioning of some of the nodes now makes build crafting much more powerful and fun. In fact, because of how the new talent trees are structured, there are now more mandatory nodes that we will have to take in order to proceed deeper into the tree. These are the mandatory nodes for the Veteran, which you will have to take if you want to reach a Keystone: Close Order Drill and Catch a Breath. In my opinion, this is a wonderful selection, since it means Veteran builds will always have some good toughness damage reduction and passive toughness regeneration available to them. We combine this with the fact that the Iron Will talent is so accessible early on in the tree, and improving your survivability as a Veteran has never been easier. Alright, let's move on to Psykers next. Here is the talent stat table. As you can see, Psykers have had some consolidation work done to its tree as well, and like the Veteran, now has more points to spend on meaningful nodes. Now let's take a look at the Psykers' talent changes. For combat abilities, the base Telkine Shield's cooldown has been increased from 40 seconds to 45 seconds, but the Bolster Shield support node now reduces the cooldown to 35 seconds. Vending Shriek's Warp Rupture support node has been reworked. It now causes enemies hit by the shockwave to deal 10% less damage and also receive 10% more damage. Scry's Gaze has had some consolidation work and minor buffs made to it. The Endurance support node that provided 20% toughness while Scry's Gaze is active has been made part of the base ability. In addition to that, Scry's Gaze now also passively regenerates 2.5% toughness while it is active. Furthermore, the Reality Anchor support node now also increases our quelling speed by 30%. This makes using force weapons, especially force staffs, while in Scry's Gaze much more manageable. For their Blitz abilities, Brain Rupture now calculates its damage increase as a multiplier rather than a flat additive to its base damage. In simpler English, it means that we can scale up Brain Burst's damage much more effectively now. The Kinetic Flare support node for Brain Rupture is now guaranteed to activate a Brain Burst every time it's available. On top of that, its cooldown has been reduced from 15 seconds to 12. Smite also had its Lightning Storm support node folded into the base talent, and its charge peril cost per second has increased slightly. As for our Keystones, Disrupt Destiny had its retargeting after death improve, and the search distance massively increased from 25 meters to 40 meters. Warp Siphon now provides 4% damage per stack after having the Empyrean Empowerment support node folded in. Now, for the base talents. In addition to the existing effects, Battle Meditation now reduces peril generated by 10%. By Crack of Bone sees a little adjustment, reducing its duration from 5 seconds to 4, and its peril reduction cost from 25% to 20%. Channel Force's Force Staff primary attack buff after a fully charged secondary has been reduced to 20%, but now it also buffs up the Force Staff's secondary damage by 10%. Crystalline Will has now leaned into the meme to become a legitimately usable node. It now doubles your overload damage and increases the overload blast radius by 25%. And if your overload explosion happens to kill an elite, not only do you not go down, but you also don't take any corruption damage either. Metal now replenishes toughness over time on crit instead of a flat amount. This can be seen as a buff or a nerf depending on how your build works. Mind in Motion now includes reloading, so you can move at full speed while reloading your guns. Penetration of the Soul had its rending buff increased to 20% instead of 10%, and now scales based on peril rather than only starting at 75%. This makes it act like Warp Rider but for rending instead of damage. Perfect Timing now increases all damage dealt instead of just warp damage. Psykinetic Aura has been normalized to provide 100% cooldown regeneration for 3 seconds instead of the 4% base. Puppet Master has its coherency radius increased from 50% to 75%. Soul Drinker now restores 15% toughness over 5 seconds instead of just an instant flat 5%. Warp Expenditure has been reworked to be a melee toughness lifesteal node, where melee weak spot kills restore 15% toughness over 3 seconds, and just landing melee attacks restores 2.5% toughness per hit. Quietude has taken over Warp Expenditure's previous function, allowing you to restore toughness both when you quell and build up peril. The conversion has been reduced from 5% per 10% peril generated down to 4% instead. As for new talents, Psykers have received a lot of defensive talents to help make it feel not so squishy. Immaterial Focus provides 10% damage resistance at base, but when at critical peril, and for 4 seconds afterwards, you become stun immune. This new talent rewards playing on the edge by ensuring you can always get your cast off without worrying about getting stunned out of it. Just a Dream allows you to redirect 25% of the damage you take into your peril instead. Warp Ghost causes your passive quelling to drop by 80%, but you gain 2 extra bars of stamina and have 25% increased toughness replenishment. Lastly, Vulnerable Mind is a simple addition that boosts your damage against Ogryns and monsters by 20%. As for the Psykers mandatory nodes, all of its nodes happen to be stat nodes, which isn't a bad thing. In fact, for Psykers, it's great because your builds will always have 50 extra toughness, 10% toughness damage reduction, and 5% critical chance boosts. As a Psyker main myself, I am very pleased with the direction of balance and the new additions that have made it into the class. When I was looking through the talent tree and trying to think of a build, I couldn't help but want to take so many nodes on the way down, which was great because that was a feeling of possibility and exploration, something we haven't had in a long while. Now, if Fat Shark could only release a couple of new Psyker staffs, that would be the cherry on top of this update. Lastly, let's take a look at the changes that have happened to Zealots. Here is the change table. Now, you might look at this table and think, what? Why do Zealots have less talents than the 2 other classes? And the reason for that is because so many nodes have either been deprecated or folded into one another, and there has been a huge injection of new talents to really give Zealots a lot of build crafting potential. This is much better compared to the sad 1 or maybe 2 builds that you were stuck with in the past. But enough chat, let's talk talents. Starting with combat abilities. Fury of the Faithful has now gained a new support node, Unrelenting Fury, where killing an elite or specialist within 5 seconds of using Fury restores 20% ability cooldown. Chorus of Spiritual Fortitude sees its Banishing Light support node, which allows you to stagger monsters and stun enemies, folded into its base talent, as it should have been from the start. Shroudfield sees its backstab and finesse damage increase to 150%, but on top of that, all of its support nodes have been either tweaked or reworked. Perfectionist now provides ability cooldown when you kill enemies from stealth. Invigorating Revelation now replenishes 50% toughness when entering stealth, and when you exit stealth, you gain 30% damage resistance. Mastercrafted Shroudfield not only increases your duration to 5 seconds, but also reduces your threat level by 75% and increases your backstab damage by 50% when you break stealth. Next are the Keystone talents. Blazing Piety's support node Fury Rising has been folded into the base talent, allowing you to build up stacks from scoring crits on its own. Martyrdom has been tweaked to be more accessible, making its total max stacks reduced from 7 to 5, but also seeing its melee damage per stack increase from 8% to 10%. So while the total potential damage is lower, it's a lot easier to get more melee damage without having to invest so heavily in wounds or taking too much damage. Maniac's attack speed has increased from 4 to 6%, giving you a whopping potential of 30% attack speed at maximum stacks. I Shall Not Fall has its toughness damage reduction increased slightly from 6.5% to 7.5%. On the Brink is a new support node that gives 10% corruption resistance per stack of Martyrdom, and Restorative Verse gives you 5% additional toughness replenishment per stack. Inexorable Judgment sees its maximum stacks increase from 15 up to 20, and Retributor Stance has been reworked to provide 0.4% toughness per second per stack when you activate the ability. This basically means that if you activate Inexorable Judgment while you have max stacks, you will be regenerating 8% toughness per second for 6 seconds. In addition to that, a new supporting node has been added in the form of Eternal, which increases the duration of Inexorable Judgment to 10 seconds up from 6. The Zealot's Loner Aura has been removed, and it has been replaced with Zealous, where you provide a 15% stamina cost reduction to allies in Coherency. Moving on to base talents. Backstabber has its damage increased from 20% to 25% and also now increases flanking damage. Desperation has been reworked to provide up to 20% melee damage based on missing stamina, rather than only activating once you run out of stamina. This is also how Warp Rider works. Enemies Within, Enemies Without has been reworked to provide 2.5% toughness per second while you are within 5 meters of an enemy. This increases by 1% per enemy up to 5 enemies. Monsters automatically count as 5 enemies and will provide you the maximum toughness regeneration of 7.5% per second. This rework gives Zealots a lot of toughness sustainability while throwing themselves into the front lines to brawl. Enduring Faith had its toughness damage resistance reduced from 50% to 40%. Duelist has actually been nerfed and now provides a 50% finesse damage boost instead of a 50% weak spot and 50% critical damage separately. Shield of Contempt and the Master's Retribution have had their cooldowns reduced from 10 seconds to 8 seconds. Invocation of Death's ability cooldown regeneration has been reduced to 100% over 3 seconds instead of the original 200% over 4 seconds. Once again, we see the cooldown regeneration normalization across classes here. Martyr's Purpose has been reworked to be much more functional. You gain up to 50% cooldown regeneration based on your missing health, which maxes out at 25% current health. Pious Cutthroat now provides 100% cooldown regeneration over 2 seconds after a melee backstab or weak spot hit. I'm just going to point this out right here. This Keystone in particular is a little too strong given its activation condition, especially when you compare it to Invocation of Death, which only activates on crit. But balanced discussions are for a different video. Moving on, let's talk about the landslide of new talents that Zealots are getting. Abolish Blasphemers gives you a 15% damage versus elite enemies. Against the Odds gives you additional damage and cleaving power for every 2 enemies within 5 meters that maxes out at 5 stacks. Behind the Lines allows you to suppress enemies within 8 meters whenever you get a heavy melee backstab kill. This has a 5-second cooldown. Blinded by Blood causes enemies to take 15% more damage while they are bleeding. This is an incredibly powerful talent. Hubris grants you a 15% damage resistance after scoring a weak spot kill for 4 seconds. Impassable gives you 25% block cost reduction while dodging and for 2 seconds afterwards. If you manage to perfectly block an attack, you restore 3 dodge charges. No Respite replenishes 10% stamina on melee critical hits on a 1-second cooldown. This is great for weapons that depend on push attacks as part of their attack combos like the Crusher and Eviscerator. Out of Pocket is a cheeky talent that allows your melee backstab kills to replenish 5% of your missing ammo from your reserves when you swap to your ranged weapon. This stacks up to 5 times. Prime Target gives you 10% damage and replenishes 15% toughness over 5 seconds on elite kill. Providence gives you 25% revive speed, and in addition to that, your allies that you assist or revive gain 10% movement speed and 15% toughness damage reduction, allowing them to haul ass out of a fire or away from danger. Relentless Feather is an incredibly powerful node that gives you 10% sprint speed and reduces your sprint cost by 10%. But on top of that, sprint for at least 1 second and you'll be granted slow immunity too. Retaliatory Defense allows you to be no longer stunned on block break and instead restores 50% stamina. Repose causes your successful dodges to build up a stacking 4% melee damage buff that stacks 5 times. Time to Kill gives you an extra 50% melee backstab damage on an 8-second cooldown. Unseen Blade provides you with an extra 15% damage against enemies that aren't actively targeting you, which is obviously very good for a stealth build. And finally, Unfaltering is probably one of my new favorite nodes because it allows you to not only become uninterruptible while charging a heavy melee attack, but it also removes all of the heavy melee attack movement penalties. With this node, you can even sprint up to a target while winding up a charged Thunderhammer strike. As for the Zealot's mandatory nodes, we get a 10% melee damage boost, the ability to avoid going down with Until Death, and some extra toughness. Not bad at all, and makes Zealots much more harder to bring down by default. So, overall, I think the Zealot's talent tree has basically transformed into a brand new version of itself. It honestly feels so refreshing to see how much more meaningful choices you can make with this update. I'm here watching all of my buddies struggle to pick up all the interesting and juicy talents because they are spoiled for choice and are short on points. With that, we've finally reached the end of all the changes that have been introduced for these 3 classes. That was really a marathon to write and put together, but I'm glad we got there in the end. If you've made it to the end of this video, share your thoughts about what you think of the new talent tree and talents introduced in the comments below. I'd like to hear what everyone else thinks about this update. I'm personally very excited about the changes, and while I've been busy pushing out videos, I haven't really had the time to sit down and buildcraft to my heart's content. Not yet at least. There's still so much more work to be done. But with that, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.